for the sake of time, I think I'm gonna introduce Mr. Grant. So um, you have quite a rich history and career in science communication, um, along with a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology in Montana, where my dad's from. So I think that's cool. Sorry.
Nice.
And a master's in marine biology and in science journalism, as well as um, oh, did anyone else hear that? Okay. Years and years of science communication work, and is now editor-in-chief at The Scientist. Is there anything else you wanted to say before you take it away?
No, I don't think so. I'm going to do a little bit of a supplementary introduction here in a second, but I think that just about covers it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so thank you. First of all, as I was telling Dr. Richards, it's a pleasure for me to engage in conversations like this. I love talking with smart people who care about things. And the thing that we're going to talk about today is kind of what I call the information ecosystem, which has changed so much just in my relatively brief time in science journalism, 15 years or so. I think it really has changed in let's say, concerning ways. And that, some people call it like the problem of our times. I don't know if I would go that far, but I do think it warrants discussion and conversation and a search for solutions. So I'll give you my disclaimer a little later on. I don't have solutions because this is such a big and kind of multifaceted problem. But I do have observations from my perspective in kind of like doing the work of science communication. So first of all, just to reiterate my introduction. So I do have a master's of science in marine biology from the College of Charleston. I did go to Montana for my undergrad, which I love, in wildlife biology. And then, like many of my peers, my colleagues in science journalism, I kind of switched courses at some point in my life and decided to cover science rather than conduct science. And I did that at NYU. They have a very good science writing program. They call them Sherpies. They call us Sherpies. And I did that around 2005. So since then, I've been engaged in science journalism for the past 15 years, much of it at The Scientist. I kind of worked my way up through the masthead, started as a staff writer. And then about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I became the editor-in-chief. For those of you who aren't familiar with The Scientist, we're a very beautiful trade publication. Technically, we're a trade publication for life scientists. But I've always thought of us as a bit more than that. It was established in 1986 by a person named Eugene Garfield, who you may know, who passed away a few years ago. But Eugene Garfield was the person who came up with the citation index and really kind of citation metrics in general. So that's how he kind of made his name and his fortune. He started The Scientist really as kind of like a passion project. I had the opportunity to really talk with him in great length about him starting The Scientist. And what he wanted to do was provide a source of information for scientists that kind of encompass not just their work, but their lives. So we've always held it very, very dear as sort of a mission at The Scientist to cover not just research and discoveries coming out of labs, but the other things that are important to scientists: publishing, policy, misconduct, things like that. So kind of like the full suite, the full constellation of issues that could be important to people engaged in the scientific enterprise. And that continues today. So we've been around for 35 years doing that. So for the eagle-eyed among you, you may know that I changed the title of my talk slightly. We'll just go back up there if I don't mess this up. It's now science communication in the time of misinformation. I think before, in the abstract that you may have received via email, it was science journalism and research in a time of misinformation. But when I sat down and thought about it, I really wanted to create kind of a space of common ground and to talk about this very important job of communicating science and how that function is actually shared between science journalists and scientists like yourselves. So we all have kind of like a lot of functions, a lot of roles that we play within our sphere. For journalists, entertaining readers is one of our jobs. Holding people accountable in positions of power is another of our jobs. Chronicling just like the basic kind of what happened and when and who was involved is another important aspect of science journalism. But really distilling science and communicating and disseminating scientific information is a big part of it. Excuse me, for scientists, I mean, obviously research, engaging in the research enterprise is kind of like the biggest role that scientists play. But there's also teaching, there's mentoring. And I find increasingly, almost whether scientists want to be involved in science communication or not, they kind of have to be. And this is for a variety of reasons. Not the least among them is this being compelled to kind of like explain science as opposed to just kind of like generating and reporting findings, because we've seen increasingly in the past few years that even strict scientific findings can be misinterpreted or completely misconstrued or miscommunicated in the public sphere. And I think as scientists, it goes beyond just kind of reporting results. It's kind of why there exists discussion sections of scientific papers, right? Like you can report results and that's great. And there's a very strict statistical measures for what constitutes a significant result and what doesn't. But as humans, I don't think we're wired to kind of like access and absorb information that way. That's why discussion sections are so important, because then you get context and you can explain the implications of those results and things like that. So in my mind, at least, this is where science journalism and the process of research overlap, in that we are both kind of science communicators, at least in parts of our jobs. So this brings us to why we're having this discussion in the first place, and the problems that we face in this kind of information ecosystem. To me, the biggest thing we're facing right now as scientists and as science journalists is that this ecosystem has become polluted by misinformation and disinformation. If you're interested in the distinctions between those things, I can go into it certainly. But misinformation in my mind is kind of, it's absent, it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily contain a self-awareness of spreading information that might not be correct or accurate. Disinformation implies that it's done purposely. I should mention here, I forgot to earlier on, if you have a burning question, a comment that is sparked by something I say or some piece of information that comes up, please feel free to interrupt and ask your question or to share it in the chat, and then it can kind of get filtered through to me. If not, I think we can save questions till the end. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion at the end of this as well. So again, that to me is the biggest problem, is that the information ecosystem that we are confronted with now has so much noise and so much inaccuracy and misinformation involved that it's tough as individuals, not to mention, being the producers of this information, but being the consumers of this information, to sort out what is good information, what is bad information. I should say here as well that the nature of that problem is not new. I think there's always been misinformation. There's always been disinformation. The reason why it's become such a big problem now is the amplification of that information. So now more than ever, everyone has a voice. Everyone has a platform, and can share information, whether or not it's valid or solid. And it can be, we as consumers of information can be exposed to that. So it's not the nature of the nature of the problem is not new, but kind of the scope of the problem is new, and the fact that these pieces of information can be amplified more than ever in human history. So going along with this, there are indications that media literacy, especially in the U.S., could be kind of low. I'll say this with kind of a grain of salt. This is from an organization called Media Literacy Now, and it's from an analysis they did in 2021. This isn't a direct measure of media literacy, which is defined as kind of the ability to decode media messages by the consumer of that media, to assess the influence of those messages on feelings and behaviors, and then to kind of, the ability to create media and disseminate information in a thoughtful way. Sounds like we have unmuted. All right, if you could mute your mic, that would be great. So this organization and this survey, it was basically conducted using kind of like proxy measures of media literacy, and it's really targeted on media literacy education. But some of these proxy measures included things like, press freedom, education, as I mentioned, and things like that. So it's not a direct measure of media literacy, but it's kind of as close as we can get until there's a more formal structure for how we define media literacy across the board. But it's mostly European countries. There's some South American countries, there's some Asian countries, but the US ranked about 15 out of the 44 countries involved in this analysis. By way of comparison, Canada ranked 4th. So suffice to say that given the fact that the US is kind of like a central figure, not just in sort of geopolitics, but in science, one could argue, not to mention in kind of the information ecosystem, it's kind of striking that it scored this low in this particular analysis. And this link is clickable, so you can investigate on your own. And I'm hoping to provide these slides. I have lots of links throughout, including those scientist covers from before, which you can link to, click through to it and read those stories. So I'm hoping to provide these after the talk as well. And if you're interested, just contact me and I can certainly send them to you. So moving along, another disturbing kind of trend is that Americans' trust in media has dipped to near record lows. So I'm going to explain this in a little more detail and give you kind of the evidence for a statement like this in a second. Sort of correspondingly, Americans' trust in scientists has also declined. And again, this is by way of kind of the best information that we can gather in the form of trusted surveys that have been sent out and disseminated widely. So to get into just kind of the meat and potatoes of this, there was a survey in late 2021. They do it every year, and it's the Gallup organization. And they just kind of survey a broad swath of Americans. It's hundreds of thousands of people that they query. And they've been doing it for a very long time. And they kind of just track people's trust in mass media. Now, mass media, they define as like newspapers, TV, and radio. So some people would call that mainstream media. And again, that's kind of, part and parcel to the shift that we're talking about is that more people than ever get their news, and we'll talk about what news is later, but get their news from sources other than these kind of main mass media outlets. But this has been tracking, and just by way of kind of replication, they've been tracking this for so long that I think it's a useful measure for just general trust in media. So you can see that through the 70s, let's say, there was a pretty high percentage of people who said, yes, I trust TV news and the newspaper that I read every morning and the radio that I listen to. By 1997, that had dropped to 53%. And it hasn't reached back up into the above 50% since 2003. So what we're faced with now is, in 2016, there was a low at about 32%. And that's interesting to me in that 2016 is when one might point to that as kind of at least the starkest break point for when these kind of problems really got concerning. It was when terms like fake news and alternative facts were introduced into kind of the popular lexicon. And that was the low point for, at least according to the survey, for Americans' trust in media. So here's the graph that they generate. You can see here, that's 2016, 32. And then 2021, which is, again, the last time they did it was in the fall. I'm looking forward to this fall when they do it again to see how that line trends. But when they did it in 2021, I think it was in October, it was at 36. So it's approaching that low. And I would be very surprised if it headed in the other direction for 2022. I think if I was a betting person, which I'm not, it would probably stay flat or decline even more. So similarly, okay, so just to review those points, 36% of Americans, only 36% express that trust in kind of those mainstream media outlets. So again, I think this reflects the fact that this information ecosystem that we all are dependent on as consumers and as producers has to do with a couple of things. The rise of the internet, which obviously didn't happen in 2016, but kind of like, has just been gathering steam since the 90s. The expansion of outlets, I think, plays into this. So no longer is it kind of the three major news TV stations with their nightly news programs and your major newspapers, but rather there's 24-hour news sources that have become, they call it news, but are obviously slanted towards opinion or towards one end of the political spectrum or the other, even though they purport to report the news. And then the obvious one is kind of this democratization of the dissemination of information, which we talked about, and we all know how that expresses itself, and that's social media. So social media really has been the key driver once again in kind of spreading mis and disinformation and baseless conspiracy theories. That's not to say that everything about social media is bad. Rather, I think there are some good things about social media, and I think that its intended purpose was sort of benign in the form of like sharing pictures of your children or keeping, encouraging community among geographically disparate groups of people. But I think that it kind of got out of control in a way that what it's used for now in terms of arguing positions back and forth in a very heated way, it wasn't designed for, and it's showing that strain is showing itself now. I usually talk a lot more about social media. I'm happy to at the end of this. I won't now in terms of like the relative benefits and drawbacks of it. But in the interest of time, we'll jump to the next point, which is how American trust in scientists has been faring. This is a little less stark, I think, but still bears discussion. This is based on data from the Pew Research Organization, who also conducts regular surveys on this type of thing. This is from February of this year, but what they found was that I think it was in December of 2021 that 29% of US adults said they had a great deal of confidence in medical scientists, and that was down from 40% the year before, from 2020. What's interesting is that their data shows, and I'll show you the actual data in a second, their data shows that there was a peak at the sort of early days of the pandemic where people really did kind of rely on scientific expertise to kind of guide them in this very scary and unprecedented situation. But then it kind of tailed off from then. Similarly, confidence in scientists, so non-medical scientists, you can think more like basic scientists, I would assume, showed a similar trend going from 2020 to 2021, going down 10 points essentially. And here's the data. It might be a little tricky to see, but you can see here 2020, this is medical scientists, went from 40 to 29, and then from 20 to 21 on the regular sciences, basic sciences, 39 to 29. And you can see here what I'm talking about. It was trending up through 19 and 20, and you see this spike in 20, and then a kind of a decline. We won't even look down here at journalists. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this reflects kind of what the Gallup poll says, is that there's not very much trust in journalists at all. And that's kind of a worrisome trend as well. We can talk about why that is again after we get there, but suffice to say for the purposes of this discussion, that is the state of play. Not only are we faced with this kind of sphere of misinformation that's penetrated ever deeper into the kind of the conversation that we have, but corresponding with that, American, at least in terms of America, trust in science, trust in journalism has declined over the past few years. So what does this result in? The first is that I think by and large, and I include myself in this as a consumer of media, there's a tendency for people to regard their news feeds, pick a platform, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. people regard their news feeds as news. So no longer is it kind of, open the morning paper and see what's going on in the world. It's open your news feed and this is what's going on in the world. The tricky part about that is, as we know, churning away in the background is an algorithm that feeds you stuff that you've displayed interest in. So it's very much tailored, which is kind of genius and kind of nice, but can also lead to problems in that what we're aware of is being fed to us as opposed to having a broader view of the world and what's going on. So this means that in the stream of that news feed, unfounded or incorrect or inaccurate information is often given equal weight in the mind of the consumer to information that might otherwise be trustworthy or independent. Opinions that are offered may kind of slip into this realm of just news that we're receiving as we scroll through those headlines. And what this means, especially with the kind of power of those algorithms, is that we're less likely, I think, to be exposed to information that challenges our biases and more likely to be exposed to information that reinforces them. Because if the algorithm says, oh, you tend to read these things or you tend to have this point of view, it's going to give you more of that. And we're less likely to be exposed to things that say, hey, wait a second, maybe how you're thinking isn't exactly right about that. One of the most dangerous kind of manifestations of this, I think, is that, it seems like an appreciation and a respect for expertise and independence has kind of eroded a little bit. This gets most scary in very recent times. You can think about the treatment of Anthony Fauci in the political sphere, in the public sphere. I mean, he has bodyguards now. So this is someone who is, people are free to have an opinion about him, but he's demonstrated a dedication to public health and to science for 50 years of his career, and he's literally his life and the safety of his family has been threatened. So that's a worrying kind of real physical outcome of these problems. So what is a scientist? What is the science communicator to do? This is where I give you the disclaimer. I don't have these solutions. These are very complex, very big problems. So all I'm doing is kind of presenting my own observations, and I think it's up to us, the people who are engaged in this act of science communication, to really kind of ferret out what are the solutions, what works in particular instances, what doesn't work in other instances. So I think it's an ever evolving kind of conversation, and it's one that I look forward to having and kind of really kind of piecing together solutions that may work going into the future.
Before we transition to this next slide, there was a question in the chat, if I can. So it was, what was the status of spread of disinformation and or misinformation in the time of this distrust? Which I think you sort of addressed, but if there's anything else you wanted to discuss about that.
So declining, I assume that the questioner is talking about the decline in trust of journalists and scientists. I mean, it's pretty apparent. I mean, it's not empirical, but just again, observation-based, anecdotally, going from 2016 to now, we've seen a whole lot more misinformation involved in this information ecosystem than we ever have before. And again, I want to stress, it's not a new phenomenon. People have lied or told tall tales, let's say, to put it in a kind of colloquial way, for a long time. Never before has every single individual with an internet connection and some device been able to spread those bits of information so widely as they are today. Again, that didn't start in 2016. 2016 is when we started to see another outcome of this that I didn't mention, which is kind of like the fracture that occurred, where for a variety, pick any topic that you want, you start to see this us versus them kind of mentality develop. And I think that plays into a lot of this erosion in trust as well, because you have some people saying, don't trust them, so yeah, I think it's not empirical, but at least from where I sit, this erosion in trust has a lot to do with kind of the amount of misinformation that's out there, and kind of feeding into people's perceptions. So a good example of what we might be able to do can be seen in something, and this is a throwback to 2015, the dress. You probably all remember this. So a giant debate erupts online, and in a way, looking back on it, it's so kind of cute. I'm gonna pause this. Hopefully, maybe I can't pause it. Oh, whoops. Well, we'll just let it cycle then. It's kind of cute in retrospect because it's such a benign thing. It's just like, oh, I see the dress and it looks like this, and I see the dress and it looks like this. Remember, this was 2015. But I like this example because it's such a nice encapsulation of how we can look at what we might consider facts, in this case, a photograph, and see completely different things based on the filter, the neural filter through which we're observing it. I have to give a hat tip to the Think podcast with Chris Boyd, who is, she had an episode a couple weeks ago with a guy named David McCraney, who's a journalism that I really like. He just wrote a book called How Minds Change. I have it all linked on the bottom there, and I can provide these slides. And they discuss this specific episode because I think David discusses it in his book. So the interesting thing here is this. Again, it's a benign kind of disagreement, right? I see the dress as black and blue. I see the dress as gold and white. This is something that people, if you'll remember, argued about back and forth. How can you possibly see it that way? I see it this way. So it was people looking at what appears to be an objective fact, right? A photograph, and coming to completely different conclusions about what that fact is. So if you almost kind of perform a thought experiment where this was the only stimulus that we were provided, and you kind of just put people, average members of the public, in a space and have them duke it out, it's very easy to kind of visualize how this might never get resolved, right? Because I see this and I see this. My eyes can't lie to me, right? So you could almost see that happening, and if those groups kind of gain some political capital, it could form very diametrically opposed groups that never got anywhere because they were just arguing about what they saw, because what they saw to their mind was an objective experience. What's cool is that neuroscientists like yourselves took it upon themselves to actually probe this difference, to go beyond saying some people see this and some people see it, to ask the question why. And one of these people was someone named Bevel Conway, and I think he's at, I forget where he is now. Hang on a second, I can tell you. He's at Wellesley College at MIT. So he published this with some collaborators. It's a correspondence, so it's not like a huge research study. It was obviously done in 2015, so it's kind of in response to the fervor that this dress created online. But what he and others have done, and this is I'm not presenting this as the reason, I'm simply presenting it as something that was done that allowed this debate to move forward beyond just like the diametric opposition. So I'm getting some noise. I think that might be, yeah, okay, thank you. So what they did was they said, first of all, importantly, ask the question, why do people see different things? This is a strange, from a neuroscientific standpoint, this is a strange phenomenon. The thing about this picture of the dress is that it's overexposed, right? So what they did was kind of dug into they surveyed, several hundred people, I think, who saw the dress, either black and blue or gold and white. And they asked questions about their perceptual kind of experience. And what they found was that people who were more likely to be early birds, right? So wake up, be exposed to sunshine more, correct for the overexposure in the image in their brain by kind of correcting for the blue light end of the spectrum. So that causes them to see it more as gold and white. Whereas people who were later rising, spent more time indoors, perhaps had a job indoors, corrected the overexposure in that image by limiting the amount of gold, yellow light, which is kind of more of the indoor light spectrum. So they, in turn, saw the dress as more black and blue, dark colors. So that kind of gets us to this point where we say, oh, okay, people are perceiving this image differently because it's an ambiguous image, and that's an important point here. Because the image is overexposed, it creates this ambiguity as to what's going on in the brain of the observer. So our brains, being what they are, undertake this process of disambiguation. So depending on your experience and the foundation of that circuitry that's doing that disambiguation, you extract this or that. So that leads to a final image, let's say, of a black and blue dress or a gold and white dress. So this, I think, has so many lessons to teach us. The first of which is that this is a pretty simple example. It's visual, it's a single item, it's a photo, but it's ambiguous in some respect. And it reminds us that our brains are expert in a few things. One of them is pattern recognition, which leads to a whole nother, branch of this conversation regarding conspiracy theories. But the other is a disambiguation engine. So the brain will perceive something and kind of correct for it based on what we carry with us, our neural baggage, let's call it. So our lived experience, our received knowledge, our religious beliefs, all sorts of things play into that. So if we think about this very simple and discrete example of a dress, and then extrapolate some of these lessons out to bigger issues, such as, an episode where a novel virus escapes into the human population and causes a global pandemic, that genesis event, that's a pretty ambiguous event. So of course our brains are going to try to disambiguate that event to make it almost palatable so that we can absorb it and so we can think about it and go on with our lives. So to me, this dress is a very good example of how we can go from I see it this way and I see it the other way to asking, why do we see it those different ways? So this is where I think, frankly, neuroscientists can play a big role in trying to lower the temperature and sort of combat a lot of misinformation by bringing this extra layer that involves, instead of butting heads and saying, I see something this way, I see something this way, it's kind of like joining hands and saying, we see it different ways. Let's talk about why that is. Let's talk about the underlying reasons for that difference. I know there's a whole branch of neuroscience called decision neuroscience, and I know that it happens at WashU. I think this is a very interesting. I'm certainly not suggesting that for every single issue we need to dive into, the neural reasons for why people have differences. But certainly there is an arm of neuroscience that deals with that, and I find it very interesting. But the main point is that I think that scientists and science journalists can add this as a feature when we're writing stories about specific issues or conducting research in a specific way, where we can add, like, almost kind of add a layer where it's talking about the why there might be a difference here, as opposed to just talking about the difference. So a long-standing kind of tenet of journalism was to kind of like introduce balance into stories. So at least from the perspective of a science journalist, one of the things that we can do to combat misinformation is to really kind of do away with this idea that every single story has to be balanced. If somebody says this, you have to present someone saying the opposite thing. That's long been kind of abandoned by science journalism. And the most clear example is in climate change, where, early on in writings about climate change, it was always presented as, oh, these researchers are generating data that indicate that humans are causing the climate to change. And these researchers say that that's not valid because of X, Y, and Z. It didn't take too long before sort of the science journalism community took a look at the landscape and said, wait a second, we're presenting this as a 50-50 proposition when really the reality is 99% of scientists think this way about climate change, i.e. humans cause it, and 1% don't. So we abandoned that kind of as a model, but I think that that illustrates an important point, and this is something that I say to my colleagues all the time, is that part of our job is to reflect the reality of what's going on. So you can't serve as a mirror to the scientific community or to the science policy or to science publishing if that mirror is distorted in one way or the other. So, anti-vaccine sentiment, this whole thing with the pandemic and where it originated, these have been very challenging things, especially with regard to the pandemic. And like I said, the sort of the lab leak story, which I'll go into in a second, was very challenging because not only is it a very rapidly evolving situation, but there's so many voices and some propositions coming from voices that, for all intents and purposes, are trusted kind of scientists, researchers, journalists, and it wasn't all kind of like a straight line, and in some ways it still is. And I think we've arrived at a point where it's pretty settled. It's becoming more and more kind of like agreed upon that it was the seafood market in Wuhan, as opposed to the lab there. But just from my perspective, it was very challenging to really kind of ascertain who to trust, who not to trust, in this respect, when you're thinking about sources. I've also arrived at the conclusion as a journalist that when we cover contentious issues, polarizing issues, I really seek out people, sources, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. Seek out sources who not just espouse their point of view and might even talk about the opposite point of view, but to really kind of seek out people who seek to move the conversation forward. Again, adding that layer of like, why are we differing here? What's going on? And to kind of dig a little deeper than just kind of like, this is how I see it and this is how I see it. So that's kind of a subtle shift. And then, just like I said before, like seeking out which perspectives, to give a platform to, that's been a challenging thing as well. And we've talked a lot about, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when I talk about sort of some of the systemic solutions. But we've talked a lot at The Scientist about who to give a platform to. And we've talked about doing like debunking, like a series of debunking kind of stories where we say, here's a claim that's out there. Here's what the science actually says. Okay, so it's kind of like this fact check feature that you see increasingly, where it's like, here's a claim, here's the actual, as close as we can get to the scientific facts behind this thing. The problem with that is we have this discussion over and over again, and I think it's good that we have it over and over again, but it's like, do we give a platform? Do we amplify this potentially mistaken information just to debunk it? So it takes a lot of thought and care when you're deciding which perspectives to kind of give a platform to and which not. So, and then, yeah, I think that plays into this kind of debunking thing too. We have to be aware of misinformation now, whereas that might not have been the case 10 years ago, at least not to this extent. And I'll give an example of this right now. And this is something that was unprecedented for us, certainly. But it was something that we can do more and more, and that's to modulate information based on like the misuse of it, even after it's published. So being a science journalist in a lot of ways is like, being a parent, in that you're writing a story, you might work very hard on it, you publish it, and then it's out in the world. My children aren't 18 yet, but once they're 18, they're going to be out in the world, they're going to have to fend for themselves. Stories are kind of the same way, but in our current climate, in the current, information ecosystem, that's not the end of the story. And this applies to science too. I think you can put science out, and then as situations develop and change, they kind of take on a life, those findings might take on a life of their own. Here's an example from The Scientist in 2015. So when the pandemic was not even, an issue, certainly there were people saying that there was the danger of these sort of things happening, novel viruses, sort of penetrating human populations and things like that. But suffice to say that this story in 2015 had nothing to do with our current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. But it was about, gain of function research, and, people were kind of getting concerned about it and saying it could be risky in some aspects. So, we did a story about it, and this is a very brief story. I think this image is linked as well. Yeah, it is. So if you want to read it, please feel free to visit The Scientist. But it's kind of a story, one of these stories that we do where it's kind of just a compilation of information from other outlets that have reported on it. So it was a very quick hit story, didn't think much of it. Then in early 2020, we saw that hey, this story is getting a huge spike in traffic. We dug into that a little bit more, and we found that people were using this story to kind of validate positions that suggested that the COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 was generated in a lab, which is not at all what this story says. So we took the kind of unprecedented step of putting a disclaimer on top of the story, which you can read there, which is like, we've noticed that on, social media and some news outlets, and this was in March. Okay, so this was very early on in the pandemic, relatively. So we just said, we noticed that this is like getting some popularity and being bounced around in different places. But we have to say that, at this point in March 2020, scientists have said that there's not really evidence that SARS-CoV-2 came from the lab in Wuhan. So to me, that's an example of kind of like a system-wide solution to misinformation. Now, I want to tell you a little bit, and again, this comes from that podcast, the Think podcast, and that discussion with David McCraney. But he talked about a guy named Tom Stafford, who is a cognitive scientist and psychologist, I think at Sheffield University in the UK. So he says, and I really like this parallel, he says that the state that we're in with information now and the problems that we're experiencing are akin to when humans started to kind of gather together in big civilizations in like urban environments and things like that. So if we accept that as a parallel kind of development, germs and pathogens had been a problem, since, for all animals, right? They're problematic. When you start coming together in larger and larger aggregations, that problem kind of takes on a different scope, right? So when humans started to gather together in bigger city type settings and with the rise of civilization, they saw like, oh my gosh, there's tons of problems that we have that are exacerbated by the fact that we're living on top of each other now. So the solutions that humanity, and they're not 100% solid solutions, because obviously we still have problems with pathogens, but the solutions that got us out of, mass cholera epidemics and, mass, typhus and things like that are kind of a direct result of living so closely together were two. System-wide sanitation. So you can stretch all the way back to ancient Rome, and they developed kind of like sewer systems and things like that to improve the sanitation of these larger settlements. And then personal kind of like hygiene, washing hands, boiling water, things like that humans had to adopt. And I think that Dr. Stafford presents this in kind of a hopeful way in terms of the information landscape that we're faced with, in that there can be two ways where we can combat this misinformation. One is on the system level, the platform level, let's call it, and it's kind of like sanitation measures. We've seen that different platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube even, has started to ban people who are acting in bad faith or obviously spreading misinformation or hate speech or whatever. This to me is an example of this. If we can go back and amend what we've already published and say, hey, this has taken on a different life, this is what we know to be the truth at this point in time. That to me represents one of those system-wide kind of salves for this problem. Another one that I've just recently noticed, and this is a screenshot of my own kind of Google News. I access the news through Google News. This isn't the algorithmically driven one. I think it is to some extent in terms of like locale and things like that. But I think this new format was introduced in late June of this year, and they have a whole fact check section. Google has had a fact check feature for about 5 years, I think since 2017. But now in your Google News feed, it's a whole section where, it just has, here's the claim and here's the fact check. And it's, organizations like PolitiFact and factcheck.org and things like that, presumably trusted sources of this information. So that's another example of system. I mean, it could be also an example, one could say, as an example of this kind of personal information hygiene as well. It's almost like selling people soap. So in the course of kind of like digesting your news, here's some soap to make sure you sanitize and kind of like make sure that the information that you're receiving and consuming is valid. I think it also has to do with education. We talked about media literacy. I think that's another key part of this kind of like sanitation, information hygiene effort, is giving people the ability, an enhanced ability, to kind of think critically about the information that they're getting. And that's a broader issue, certainly. So in terms of the practice of this, of kind of combating misinformation and even anti-science kind of sentiment, I really do think, and this is just kind of, again, my perception in years of kind of like grappling with this issue, I really think that a key is to be non-confrontational. It's so easy, as I said, things have been fractured into us versus them. It's so easy just to think of like my point of view and then the opposing point of views, and not really go that extra step to understand why people think that way, or to fully incorporate or give them the space to kind of like explore their own opinions. So I think that kind of that listening, the ability to listen to people and be non-confrontational is super important for journalists to do, as well as scientists potentially. Any assertions that are made, and I've done my best to do this in terms of the assertions that I made even during this talk by giving evidence and things like that, have to be explained fully and contextualized, as well as be based in evidence. It simply doesn't suffice anymore to say like, this is what I think is going on. Rather, there has to be some form of support, whether that's, anecdotal or experiential or more rigorous in terms of experimentation. And as I said before, I think that the missing layer of information often involves exploring why we disagree. And this is where I think science can be very helpful, especially from neuroscience, because, decision neuroscience, how we process the world, which is full of seemingly objective things that are really subjective if we really burrow into it, it can be so helpful in just kind of like easing the pressure, lowering the temperature, so that we're not so bent on disagreeing, but rather kind of just that subtle shift into like thinking about why we disagree is a super important like overlay here. Education, I think, has to be an ongoing effort, both from journalists and from scientists. I think often we report findings and we neglect the importance of thinking about our audience. This is something you're trained to do as journalists, like think about your audience, literally think about the person reading your story, in terms of their comfort with how science works. And this can get repetitive at times, but I think it's necessary to kind of just hammer home. You can't assume that people automatically understand that science is incremental, that it's built on, previous findings, that it can be, modulated so that yesterday's findings are partially true, but not all the way true, because we found this additional information about a particular phenomenon. I think that's super, like the nuts and bolts of how science works, as opposed to just what science finds, is something that we can do a better job in across the board. As I said, compassion and patience must be exercised. I think this is something that's very hard to do, especially when you're talking about people who are willfully resisting scientific information, and would seemingly, it would be at odds with the very principles of science. But I do think that giving people time and space to kind of explain why they've arrived at the conclusion they've arrived at really does help in kind of not just lowering the temperature, but helping them to kind of self-analyze why they have those views. In March of this year, I had an opinion piece written by Bill Sullivan, who is a toxicologist, I think, at Indiana University. And he said something in that piece that I really, really liked. And again, this is linked, so you can go to the scientist and read it. But I think this is a super important point, and it applies to journalists as much as it applies to scientists and physicians. And he said, we got into science and medicine to help people, and like it or not, that includes those who have turned their back on the establishment. He was talking about, the established scientific kind of community and the very process of science. I think that's true of journalists too. Even if we're basic scientists, or if we're financial journalists or whatever, we get into these fields not because we want to simply kind of report the facts or conduct science. There's typically a human element to this where we want to help people, and I think we have to remember that, because too often I think when we get into this us versus them mode, we contribute to that butting of heads rather than trying to ease it and kind of like, make it less confrontational, which would hopefully bear the fruit of there being less misinformation and people kind of hewing to something that's closer to a shared truth. So I think that's about it. I think there's a couple more chats. My contact information is here. If you'd like to get in touch, I'm more than happy to speak with any of you.